Legacy of a Traitor, Chapter 2. My name was Evranian Kingshield. I led a proud tribe of warriors, named and honor-bound through an ancient covenant that spanned eons to the noble kingdom of Error. This former realm of peace lay alongside the Jormund River, now stained red with the atrocities that befell the city of Heaven Nor. Verse 2 of the Confessional Monolith. The view of the Caerfell Range from the watchtower of the Aurorian Citadel was something truly spectacular. A mountainous wall of shifting life which stood in the way of the horizon, slowly changing from green to ochre red and resting finally in white. New life would then spring up in a sea of pink buds before the cycle began anew. Seth Surnir had seen this cycle play out upon the range almost 23 times, for as long as he could remember, and every time the valley seemed to grow ever more precious to him. However, beautiful and predictable as the cycle was, with it came the need to adapt for each turn of the trees. Wood must be prepared for heat, food must be stored up, and shelter must be reinforced. Failure to do so would end in suffering and death. The citadel, however, stood as a stark contrast to this enslavement to the whims of nature and the land. Throughout the years, it had remained steadfast and secure with little effort, no matter what trials the outside world flung at it. Such a wonder should never be taken for granted. Seth continued to gaze at the landscape for a few seconds longer. It was now wrapped in the last burst of color before the snow fell upon it and the year came to an end. It's almost exactly 10 years now since Father left me as a lord. The final audible words Lord Surnir I had left Seth while in the throes of his fatal illness still resounded in his head, the small sounds whispered between gasps.
King Genra, a secret, protected, controlled citadel.
Even those had been so faint. Seth shook his head as a chill breeze blew past him. There was no use in dwelling on the past, nor on selfishly appreciating the magnificence of his home. Pulling himself from the view, Seth walked back into the lit halls of the highest quarter of the citadel with the practiced cadence of an Erorite lord. As he walked through the archives, those precious rooms filled with biographies, tomes, and artwork of his ancestors, he took a deep breath, the words of his father pulling at his mind. He had yet to discover their meaning, so he would keep them secret until then. He had barely closed the door of the archives behind him when he heard the quick yet controlled steps of his royal aide, Madame Aethel Gierno, clicking up the grand stairway, and he braced himself for the lashing of a lecture he was about to receive yet again. "Lord Surnir, I requested an audience with you over 3 hours ago. A lord should always hear what his aide has to report as soon as possible, or at the very least he should send a message of a delay." Madame Aethel was an older woman, with formerly dark hair that had not quite fully silvered yet, and a strong gleam of beauty within her eyes that gave energy to the whole of the citadel, and kept it running in a smooth and orderly fashion, as she had done for Lord Surnir I. Even though the way she constantly berated Seth for not ruling the way his father did was exhausting, often with lectures that could wear away at your very soul, she was a true ally of the citadel, and someone that Seth was extraordinarily thankful for. Regardless, as she reached him, Seth realized he could hardly remember a time when he was excited to see her. "I sent 2 different messengers, and both of them told me you would be arriving soon. Soon is not a precise time, Lord Surnir, especially for someone who is trying to schedule the preparations for a feast." Seth nodded with a hopefully placating smile. "Yes, and I do apologize, Madame Aethel, but the messengers also told me that you simply had a general, non-urgent report on the status of the citadel. If there have been no requests from the Caerfellians, and nothing drastic has come to your attention, then I thank you for keeping everything running as well as you do, but I don't need to see a report of it now. I can always receive such a report at the end of each day, and make decisions on improvements then, provided you haven't already thought of them, which you usually do." Madame Aethel let out a frustrated sigh. "You know that's not the reason why I ask this. If a lord is constantly active in the daily routine of his citadel in peacetime, it helps everyone to feel more confident in their leader. Your father always spent a few hours each day to make the rounds of the keep and ensure that everything was in proper order. He even helped with minor tasks here and there. It inspired and provided a level of camaraderie to the whole of the citadel." Seth shook his head. "The only thing I would inspire in them is pity. You know that I would simply slow down the overall rate of work with my lack of experience." "Then get that experience by trying it. You won't find it in your personal quarters or the archives, that I am certain of. Seth closed his eyes for a moment in annoyance. Yet it is there where I can read the texts of history, and perhaps I can find some of the lessons that my father failed to teach me before he died. How can I continue Father's mission to create a peaceful kingdom in this valley if I don't know more than the basics on how to rule? Am I to make guesses and risk putting hundreds of our people into danger? Madame Athel pinched the bridge of her nose, closing her eyes. With respect, Lord Cernier, that is utterly ridiculous. We have no aggressive foes or bandits plaguing our borders, bountiful lands, and a happy people. Why, the only way into or out of the valley collapsed over 2 decades ago, so our peace is remarkably secure. You won't upset that through a few imperfect actions. Without missing a beat, she began wagging her left forefinger at Seth. And that's the third issue. You claim to continue your father's mission, and yet you are a 23-year-old lord with not even the beginning of a courtship within your experiences. You are the last of the Cernier line. You must do something to ensure that isn't the case, especially for the sake and control of your family's secret. There are many eligible maidens among the Carfelian natives. If you were to take one of them as your lady, you would create a much more visible bond with them. It took a bit of willpower for Seth to not sigh in irritation upon hearing this specific lecture yet again. Or it would appear to the Carfelians that I would be taking from them in an irreversible way due to the naturally limited reproduction of their people, causing the rift between us to widen more. Athel threw her hands up and rolled her eyes. Always the same response. You never inherited your father's bravery. This feast is the largest thing you've ever done of your own accord. It wouldn't kill you to invest more of your time into it. She twirled around and started down the grand stairs. As for the report, it's still sealed in the main hall, and it has to do with the outskirt stewards. I'd have already read it if I were you. Seth remained at the top of the steps until Madame Athel was out of sight, giving her words some thought. It wasn't as if he'd never left his quarters, but it was true that he didn't participate as much as he remembered his father had done back then. Ah, well, it was true that he'd already stepped into the pond by announcing the celebrational feast and raising the Carfelians' quotas, deviating from the steady and ordered schedule his father had set up many years ago. He might as well take the dive, at least within the shallows. He took a deep breath, then began to descend the grand spiraling steps, down into the Citadel's keep. These stairs were an impossibility in any building other than an Aurorian fortress. They stretched from the very ground under the keep to the highest part of the central tower in one long, continuous spiral. They didn't have a central pillar to rely upon, but hundreds of small poles of white stone shooting outward, making the surrounding walls and the stairs one and the same structure. Occasionally, the spiral would have openings on the side that led to bridges made of the white stone, so that the other floors were all accessible from the one stairway. Glancing down to appreciate the fullness of his ancestors' design, he saw a somewhat winded guard, a young man called Voy Ale, climbing up the stairwell. Seth waved at him. "Hello, Voy. What's the news?" Voy jumped.
"Oh, Lord Cernier. It's just a shipment for Ser Gierno. I mean, a message of a shipment.
No worries then. Go ahead."
Yes, Lord Cernier."
Voy hurriedly bowed and crossed a bridge over to the Gierno chambers, just beneath the archives. There surely must be a better way to deliver messages throughout the Citadel. Seth continued downwards, thinking on how information should be relayed in times of urgency. While a good defense against a potential foe, the stairwell made it difficult for easy and quick communication. Despite the incredible nature of these structures, there were also certainly strange flaws. Aurorian fortresses were designed to place the Lord's Quarter in the highest floor of the tower, as it was the most defensible area and almost certainly the last place to fall. However, it also guaranteed no way to escape in dire circumstances. Seth had read about many other types of castles in the wider world, each with their own quirks and secrets, and nearly all of them had a hidden passageway for the Lord to bring his family to safety. An oversight of the Aurorian architects, or pure arrogance. Oddly enough, Seth had found almost nothing about the style of fortress he had lived in all his life within the old tomes in the Royal Archive, so he had no idea what the truth was. Perhaps his father would have known. Seth had barely shaken the thought of things past from his head when he heard an enthusiastic whoop of joy coming from the Gierno chambers, one normally unexpected from such a deep voice. A moment later, a portly and bespectacled man flung open the door across the closest bridge, a ridiculous smile plastered over his face.
"Oh, Seth! Did you hear the news? A new delivery of stone gut has arrived, and it is an exceptionally good batch, too.
Seth instinctively stepped out of the way as Sir Eldred Giarno started running down the stairs, taking 2 steps at a time. Though he was the son of Madame Athel, El was the polar opposite of her in every way. Well, except for the sheer determination that they shared. Though Seth had little family, he felt that he had both an older and younger brother in El. He had been born nearly 8 years before Seth, yet was far more unconcerned about keeping up the proper appearance of a high-ranking Genra knight, and his severe lack of self-preservation when he was excited had always concerned Seth immensely. He winced as El almost slipped, clutching the handrail at the last moment. "Well, that is good to hear, but please be careful. You could break your neck if you fell at that speed." Eldred steadied himself and waved dismissively at Seth.
"Oh, pish-posh, I'll be fine. I haven't sustained an injury in years. Oh, but that reminds me. Please visit the Third Garden later this week. If this batch is as good as it sounds, I may very well have a breakthrough with the gut tree. A new strain of stone gut will be brought into our world. Mark my words."
"I'll be sure to do so, but that won't be possible if you are in the infirmary. The stone gut won't be going anywhere, so just... oh, well." El had already sped off again, leaving Seth worriedly glancing downward. He could see Sir Giarno moving every step of the way as the spiral stairs continued to widen the closer they were to the ground floor. The design was perfect for assailing potential invaders constantly from higher steps, but it only meant now that Seth had to watch every single minor stumble and slip that El made on his reckless dash downwards with hands clenched on the guardrail. He breathed a sigh of relief as El reached the bottom safely, disappearing from sight towards the eastern gardens, having descended nearly 300 feet in just over a minute. Eldred had devoted much of his life to learning about the flora of the Carfelian Valley, and had succeeded in cultivating special strains within the gardens of the Citadel. Despite this, stone gut had always proved impossible to keep alive, let alone grow, anywhere but deep in the Carfell Mountains. With a steady supply from a skilled forager, he had been getting close to changing that. Could today be the tipping point? Seth hoped so. That plant was absolutely delicious, and it would hopefully keep El from dashing down the stairwell like that whenever a new bud arrived. As he continued down, Seth wondered if he should stop worrying so much about the risky habits of the other Genra knights. Ever since he could remember, Seth had always hated even seeing someone balance on the rafters of the Great Hall to paint the ceiling, regardless of whether they had plenty of scaffolding and ropes to keep them safe. Was it because of his position and the responsibility that came with it? His father had ensured the safe conduct of everyone in the Citadel, but Seth couldn't remember him ever being tense with fear upon seeing a child leaning over the edge of the outer parapets in excitement, dangling their upper torso 50 feet above the ground. That memory still made Seth wince at how he had lost all measure of composure over something so unnecessary, begging his father to outlaw children upon the ramparts. Nevertheless, he still agreed with his younger self that the child should not have been in such a frightening position, simply for safety's sake. To be fair, there hadn't been any deaths from accidents, or even any serious injuries within the Citadel for as long as Seth could remember, so perhaps it was simply his own distaste for heights and the pointless tempting of fate that caused this consternation. And besides, El was the one who created such situations on his own 9 times out of 10. Seth shook his head, trying to clear the dilemma from his mind. When he was as capable as his father had been as an overseer of the Citadel's construction, he would try to build upon what existed. Some sort of advanced police station set up in the central shaft of the stairwell would certainly be welcome and fairly feasible. It would ease the delivery of messages, allow the elderly to visit the archives, and it would prevent reckless knights from nearly killing themselves. However, if it was built sloppily, it would be far more dangerous than if it had never existed. Seth shuddered, imagining a snapping rope causing the dreamed machine to plummet hundreds of feet to the ground, breaking apart with a thunderous crash. Even the slight chance of such a future was unacceptable. To avoid building such a station, Seth would need the skills of a master engineer at his command. He would need wisdom like his father's to find someone truly capable, considering the architect of the Citadel left the valley shortly before its completion. Anyone short of that would be too risky to hire. The closer Seth got to the main floor of the Citadel, the more people could be seen moving from room to room, going about their day and completing their assigned tasks. There were exactly 157 of them living in the Citadel that Seth had memorized, counting the new child born last week to Cialine, one of the chefs. Seth had ensured that everything she needed was provided, and had even opened one of the empty side rooms for her to spend the first few months of her leave in peace. It was hard to imagine that only 50 individuals had lived here over 30 years ago in this spacious citadel. There was still probably enough room for another couple hundred people to live comfortably, though the need for quality food and supplies continued to rise. It was a good thing his father's strategy for befriending the Carfelians had been so successful. How terrible it would be to have it all go to waste if Seth made any errors in judgment.
Your lordship, this is a pleasant surprise. What brings you down from your loft?
Seth glanced towards where a nearly retired guard was lounging on his lawn-padded seat, grinning at Seth from the base of the stairwell at the back of the great hall. "Hello, Valmir. Be at ease." That was how his father had always greeted the guards of the citadel. It was apparently something of a tradition for Arorite lords, but it always amused Seth just how pointless it was to say it to Valmir. The man couldn't look more relaxed if he tried. "I'm simply inspecting how the citadel is running. I have nothing worrying or concerning to report. Same as you, it seems." Valmir chuckled.
"You have it right. There's just a bit of bustle regarding that feast you announced. Though now that you're here, I was wondering where exactly we're holding it. I heard a rumor that you'll be opening the old dining hall for the first time in 30 years. Now, I am not one to try and impose, but I'd prefer that we keep your father's wishes and leave that old place alone."
Seth shook his head at the notion, though Valmir's concealed worry intrigued him. "Don't worry, I wasn't planning on it. We have plenty of room here in the Great Hall, and there will be an entire festival set in the town square for feasting."
Excellent. I'm looking forward to it, your lordship."
Valmir leaned back, practically laying down at this point.
"It's been a while since the Citadel's seen such excitement. Why, it might just compare to the celebration we had when your father led us here from Mistbay 30 years ago."
Only because of what the Genra Knights had built since that day. For many years, Seth had listened with wide-eyed wonder to the stories about how the elders of the 4 citadels of the valley had crossed the Carfell Mountains when they were little more than boys, how his father had swiftly defeated the 3 warlike lords who had opposed him, and how his valorous skill laid the foundation of the happy life the inhabitants of the land enjoy today. However, he hadn't heard much of the day-to-day life of those first few years in the valley. Perhaps that wasn't particularly surprising. Madame Athel didn't try to embellish the historical details, and the few memories Seth had of his father telling them were very short and to the point, almost as if he had been too modest to fully expound his deeds. Perhaps Valmir might help in that regard. There might be a few Arorite traditions in his retelling that Seth could revive for future feasts. Besides, it would be nice to hear some of the strategies his father employed back then for closing the gap between the Arorites and the Carfelians. One ulterior thought sparked in Seth's mind. It may even offer clues on my father's words of the Surnir family's secret. Valmir, your memory of those days and the conquests of my father are still bright in your mind, I hope. Would you relate these events to me after the celebrational feast, once I have the chance to really focus on them? The old guard sat up, hesitating for a moment before bowing.
"Of course, as you command."
Seth wondered at the pause. Was he simply surprised at the unconventional request Seth had given him, or was there something deeper at hand? Regardless, he had agreed, so there wasn't any point in lingering on the matter for now. "Thank you, Valmir. Oh, and don't indulge too heavily in the special bottles at the feast. I don't want a story smeared to opacity with drink."
You're too harsh, lordship,"
Valmir chuckled.
"I can walk off more than you think, but I'll keep it in mind."
Seth nodded as Valmir laid back down on his seat. The old, forbidden dining hall was off to the right of the staircase's base. It had clearly been designed as a room to be used often, as it was directly connected to the great hall, where most meals were held these days. Why was it that his father was so adamant about the strange room's emptiness? It was late in the week and the afternoon was half past, so Seth was certain that there was someone assigned to cleaning it right now, according to his father's masterpiece, the schedule. The schedule set by Lord Surnir I was quite detailed, and Seth considered it the biggest reason everything flowed so well in the citadel. It covered the whole of the Arorite responsibilities, as well as the governance of the Carfelians throughout the year. A simplified form of the schedule hung in the main hall, and 3 copies were in the possession of the Genra Knights. 2 were kept safe inside the archives, and Madame Athel personally carried the last one. Seth had perfectly memorized all 20 pages years ago, and though he still didn't understand the reason for some of the specific orders, he knew each one must be important in some way. The strangest ordinance by far was this weekly cleaning of the old dining hall, despite the command it never be used. A quick check-in would be good, as he hadn't visited the room in over a year. There had been no need to with the excellent reports, but Seth almost found it amusing that he hadn't entered such a large room in his own citadel for so long. The large doors, decorated with images of old Cernian legends, were slightly ajar, and Seth slipped in. As the glass-dappled light struck his eyes, he froze for a moment in awe. He had forgotten how wonderful the late daylight shining through the large stained glass perfectly accentuated every corner of the nearly crystal-clean room. The figures from legend that were on the door were brought to life with painstaking detail on the colorful windows, eyes flashing with the sun as they watched over the inhabitants of the room. For what possible reason could his father have commanded this lovely place be closed? In the strange but rather enchanting room, there were no tables or any objects. The sole and temporary inhabitants were a few servants from the lower families, idly scrubbing the floors while singing rhythmic folk songs. While not knights chosen by the great King Genra to act as stewards in his name, these families were Arorites as well, and had been loyal to the Surnir clan for generations, long before they had ever come to the Carfelian Valley. Seth had spent a good amount of time memorizing each and every one of their names and habits. It was only right, as they were under his responsibility, even though he had barely talked to any of them at length. Though Seth was sure he had been quiet so as not to disturb their work, one of the younger maids with a red sash perked up at his presence, and leapt up to her feet as she spun to face him. "Oh, if you're here, is it already time for the evening meal?" This rather blunt remark caught the attention of everyone else, and made Seth blink with surprise. That's right, she was Mari, from one of the larger families. A few of her companions turned a shade of red and looked away in second-hand embarrassment, and her mother, Anita, quickly bowed to Seth. "I'm sorry for her outburst, Lord Surnir. Mari, how dare you speak so familiarly?" Mari seemed to realize her greeting to him had been odd and bowed slightly. Yeah, sorry about that. Is the evening meal prepared yet, Lord Surnir?" Well, that was still pretty familiar, but it didn't really bother Seth. Yes, he was the lord, but he felt that he hadn't earned the right to consider himself worthy to be honored like his father had been. Seth hoped that eventually he would learn enough to begin earning that same respect, but he knew that time was still a ways off. "Oh, don't be concerned, Anita. I wasn't looking for a grand entrance. It's simply been a while since I've looked at this room. No dinner yet, I'm afraid." Seth glanced up again at the dark golden light, smiling. "It is wonderfully beautiful, and I can tell that you haven't been shirking the weekly duty here." Anita sighed in relief. "Thank you, Lord Surnir." "Sure, but I had a question about that weekly duty." Mari gestured around the room. "Every time we get it as clean as possible, but it's never perfect. Look at those weirdly colored sections on the floor and this pillar. They've been here forever, no matter what we do." Seth knelt down next to one of them. They were a bit of an eyesore when focused on, especially with how they clashed with the pure white stone, but they weren't obvious. If this room had tables and carpets, Seth wouldn't have noticed them. Perhaps they will disappear when given enough time. A constant flow of soap may just be what they need. Mari folded her arms and shook her head. "Sir, my grandmother was scrubbing these splotches. I'm fairly sure it would have come off by now if it was ever going to. Do you know why we gotta keep doing it, respectably, sir?" "In all honesty, Murray, I do not know the exact reason. However, it was one of my father's orders, and it would be foolish to stop upholding such a defined command until we know exactly why it was given to us in the first place." He touched one of the discolored stones, feeling for any difference in texture. "These floors might scuff, or become even more discolored over time without constant washing. There might be some sort of plant growth that occurs only in this room, and scrubbing it keeps it at bay." No, he felt no physical oddity, but there was still something strange about it. "Or perhaps our ancestors and the spirits of the valley visit here from time to time, and they prefer a clean place to rest within. In any case, I've placed trust in the wisdom passed down to us." "If I were a spirit, I wouldn't mind a bit of dust," Mari mumbled, but she asked no further. Seth noticed she had already forgotten about Anita's reprimand about his title. Respect for the authority of the Lord as a whole seemed to be slowly waning among all but the older generations. But Seth couldn't really blame them. His father had done so much within his rule, and he had certainly been more imposing than Seth. In many ways, he still was. As her daughter bowed to Seth and turned back to her work, Anita looked relieved. "Lord Surnir, we shall consider your words well. Perhaps the true reason could be revealed through an investigation. It would put our minds, especially Mari's, at ease." Seth stood up, brushing some lingering soap bubbles from his knees. "Of course, it shouldn't be too difficult to set aside a few men for that sometime after the celebration. I have been curious about this strange room's requirements myself, as nothing has been explained in the archives or in the pages of the schedule. I wouldn't expect anything major to come of an investigation, but if there is, Mari will be the first to know." "Thank you, Lord Surnir." Anita bowed. "There's a guard trying to get your notice." Seth turned to see a younger guard, barely old enough to fit his armor, awkwardly glancing back and forth, trying to interject. He perked up at Seth's attention and said, Uncle Joriam wishes to speak with you, my lord. He pointed past the ajar doors of the dining hall, and Seth could see Sir Joriam, the officer of materials and the general knight in charge of taking in the quotas of the Carfelians today, waving at him from the great hall. He was the same age as Seth, and, like his lord, one of the 10 intermediaries between the Carfelians and the Arorites, as the schedule ordained. Thank you, Blythe. I'll go to him immediately. Anita, Maury, all of you, keep up the good work. Seth smiled in what he hoped was confidently appreciative, and walked out of the mysterious room as they all bade him farewell. He was thankful for them, that was no lie, but their efforts were all under the assumption that his directions were masterfully designed and purposeful. If they knew just how unsure Seth felt every moment of the day, simply grasping at the written words of his father, would they feel betrayed? Would they know that the one they served was barely more than a fraud, setting only small plans into motion with a trembling hand? Seth forced these thoughts out of his mind again as Joriam eagerly began talking. Lord Sernir, the final Carfelian workers have submitted their quotas for the Red Hill Moon, and almost all of it has been registered in our storages. Hello, Officer Joriam. That is wonderful news, but tell me, how was the Carfelians' reception to the reduced payment? Was the celebratory feast enough to placate them? Though Seth spoke with a dignified candor, his heart was beating fast. As the first major decision of his rule, Seth had worried for weeks before raising the Carfelians' quota by 15%, only managing to send the order through the encouragement of Madame Athel. The thought of how the Carfelians might take it still worried him immensely, but it had been necessary to do so. The population of the Citadel had grown to more than triple of what it had been 30 years ago, and what the Carfelians were incentivized to give was not quite enough to supply everyone comfortably. No one was starving, but many types of food had been rationed over the last year. It was a problem that would only get worse, so the quota was raised. Seth had designed the celebrational feast to soften the impact and curtail any ill will, but it was still a gamble. Now he would know if it had paid off. Joriam laughed. The promise of the feast was certainly enough, my lord. Only a few even grumbled about the quota increase in the first place. Your idea of throwing a celebration was absolutely brilliant. It felt as if a weight the size of the Citadel had been lifted from Seth's shoulders. His first major ordinance had been a success. Of course, he wouldn't know the full feelings of the Carfelians until the time of the feast itself, but Seth was still excited nonetheless. Thank you, Joriam. Were there truly none who sought an audience with me about it? Well, not about that little thing. However, Mr. Thessling the woodworker does wish to speak with you later this week. Joriam gestured towards a decently large sack of bulky objects on the table with an irritated glare. Ah, Thessling was one of the few Carfelians who consistently made use of the right to ask for an audience with the Lord of the Citadel, a privilege available to all the people of the valley, though rarely used. Even when a Carfelian did, it was usually nothing more than to complain about certain local disagreements, ask minor questions regarding Arorite custom or legend, or sometimes simply wanting an important person's ear to gnaw at. Thessling was a rather bittersweet exception. He was purposeful in his talks, but a little bit of a blowhard who used unnecessarily complicated Carfelian phrasing to get his point across, not to mention his flagrant use of insults at the first sign of annoyances. Though he drained Seth of much of his energy whenever he came knocking, Thessling was one of the biggest reasons Seth spoke the Carfelian tongue so well. Joriam continued. I'm sure he feels shame for what he has done in creating a surplus of wooden ducks that no one wants, and he wishes to know in detail what we desire from him beforehand to prevent such a dismal display in the future. Seth noticed the spite dripping in the officer's report. It could only be caused by one thing. Did he inadvertently insult little Jory again? Joriam hesitated a moment, then nodded, shame of his own showing through. He was admirably protective of his 4-year-old son, but Seth had talked with Thessling enough to know that his insults probably weren't intentional. You have my apologies, Lord Sernir. I won't let personal emotions get in the way of my reports. Seth shook his head. I'd rather you tell me such things and have hidden grudges wear away at our tentative bond with the Carfelians. Don't worry, I'll have a word with Thessling about this, but we do need to try not to upset the people of the valley, even when some are crude towards us. Achieving my father's goal is necessary for continued peace, and so long as they aren't taking advantage of our kindness, we should let them be. He patted Joriam on the shoulder, attempting to exude the same confidence that Svalmir did whenever he gave advice. How did the old soldier make it seem so effortless? Well, just let me know if it happens again next month. Keep up the excellent work." Joriam smiled a bit, then stepped away from the awkward shoulder pat and bowed. "As you command, Lord Sernir. Thank you." Seth nodded farewell to Joriam as the officer left to put the final touches on the quota storages. The light streaming from the courtyard beyond the hall had dimmed substantially, and some of the servants were preparing the table for the evening meal. It had taken much longer than Seth had expected to walk about the Citadel's keep, but the conversations with those who looked to him for leadership had been, well, surprisingly refreshing. He would try to do this again tomorrow, and hopefully make it a common habit. That way he would be one step closer to his father, and as such, one step closer to a man suitable to rule the valley. Sitting down at the table of the main hall, Seth looked for the message Madame Athel had told him about. It wasn't hard to find, as it lay on a small platter on the tablecloth. It was a very ornate platter, with several rare gems encrusted onto the rim. It was only ever used for the main dish on important celebrations, and even then only when the food wouldn't stain it. On top of it sat a piece of parchment, still folded and sealed with a wax emblem of 3 towers. Seth sighed with embarrassed annoyance. This extravagant display had clearly been set up by Madame Athel. As he gingerly picked up the message, he imagined her overbearing voice sarcastically exclaiming, "Only the rarest and most special of events will bring you out of your chambers, won't they, Lord Sernir? Well now, is this special enough?" A servant standing nearby, Marchie, one of Madame Athel's closest assistants, retrieved the platter with an overly dignified bow, bringing it back to the kitchen. Seth could just feel Madame Athel smirking somewhere nearby. Shaking his head, Seth broke the seal of the outskirt stewards. These stewards were high-ranking servants of the 3 lords who had been defeated by Seth's father, though now all but one of them were the children of the original generation. Though they had all sworn to serve the Sernir family by watching over the other 3 citadels in the valley, they had no true power, or even many Carfelians to keep safe compared to the village citadel. One of the other citadels had been built on the rocky heights by the eastern Carfel mountains on the far side of the valley, another in the midst of an extremely dense forest near the sea cliffs to the south, and the last half sunk within the northern lake. Each was architecturally identical to the citadel Seth lived in, but why they had been built in such strange places was beyond him. Nevertheless, Seth was told it was a very peaceful job, but one he imagined being fairly lonesome and claustrophobic. Supplies would be delivered from the village citadel every month, but beyond that and a yearly feast, there wasn't much occasion for travel. As Lord of the Valley, he had been to each one a few times for diplomatic purposes, but he always had a sense of unease being so far away from the sound of the village. Their message was shorter than Seth had expected, but it was written with a focused hand. "This message to Lord Sernir II brings news of the peaceful transfer of stewardship of Lake Eye Citadel from Cowron Ives to his son, Rashon Ives, which occurred 2 months ago." Already the news was bold and rather troubling. Though they were fairly autonomous, to change the current steward without notifying Seth was a deliberate sign of apathy towards his rule. It only took a week to send a message via cart, especially in this season, so the real reason this was being written at all must be coming later. However, if the transfer was peaceful, then there was nothing inherently wrong with the action. Cowron and Rashon seemed to have a good relationship, and during last year's feast, Cowron had mentioned he was planning on retiring soon, and letting his 20-year-old son take the reins, but Seth hadn't expected it to happen so quickly. Now all 3 stewards were of Seth's generation. He continued reading, a worry beginning to burn in his stomach. "With this passing of the ruling torch, we 3 stewards have taken this occasion to come together to request clear answers on the rule of Lord Sernir II, and to present our founded worries on the current law. Our fathers swore to serve your family in every way they could, out of a desire for mutual assistance and peace in the valley, but also, naturally, out of fear of Lord Sernir I's might. This pledge is now a remnant of the past, as none of us were even alive when it was instituted 30 years ago, and so we wonder if the need for it has expired." The worry in Seth's stomach became a flame that was fanned by the beat of his heart. Though the outskirts stewards had always been interested in gaining more power, the pledge Lord Sernir I had made them take ensured that his schedule and law would be followed to the letter. Without the pledge, Seth's hold on the valley would weaken, and infighting might occur, which would bring harm to the Carfelians and the Genra Knights alike. Or even worse, it could lead to a war like the one his father quelled. "All of Lord Sernir I's laws have remained utterly unchanged, and our positions have become stagnant. We need to push forward with High King Genra's plans to make the valley our own. The Carfelians would make excellent servants to clear the forests, build bridges, and sculpt the mountains. Our citadels would make us invincible against any retaliation. Or are we to remain trapped in our own castles until we grow old and die, achieving nothing? The edges of the parchment crumpled slightly as Seth clutched it tighter. What were they thinking? Yes, his father's plan was taking a long time, but the Carfelians weren't hostile against the Genra Knights in the slightest. Such a forceful measure would surely end in a conflict between the Carfelians and the Arorites, from which no clear winner would arise. The Genra Knights would be confined to the walls of the citadels in an uncomfortable siege, and the Carfelians would be introduced to bloody warfare for the first time in their history. Worst of all, from their words, the stewards might begin this foolish scheme just based off of twisting the words of the pledge. Seth had no choice. He would have to threaten with the Surnir family's secret, and hope that it would be enough. We hope that you make the wise decision, and move forward with the original goals of our common ancestors. Signed by Steward Ives, Steward Jesper, Steward Borthel. There was no time to waste. Even if there was, Seth couldn't possibly function as a ruler with this threat hanging over his head. Well, Lord Surnir, you finally read it. Was the news as bad as your demeanor betrays? Madame Aethel appeared from the doorway to the gatehouse courtyard. She might have been preparing to lecture him on how long it had taken, but she seemed to have some mercy upon seeing the distress on his face. I am afraid so. Please take dictation from me. I wish to respond to this message immediately. Madame Aethel was quiet for a moment, before nodding solemnly and requesting a message parchment from Marchie. When it arrived, Seth began. This reply to the message sent by Steward Ives, Steward Jesper, and Steward Bortel is from His Lordship Seth Surnir II. I offer my congratulations to Steward Ives, and accept his rightful ascension. However, I also request that he present momentous changes to the daily events of the Lake Citadel within the month of their occurrence. It was always good to start a reply with a measure of amiability, but the second half deserved harsher words. In regards to the pledge your elders made to my father, I still hold that the need for it has not yet expired, and it will not do so until a permanently peaceful existence has been secured throughout the whole valley. Though it is slow in implementation, it shall be utterly effective, and provide peace not for just one generation, but for all those who follow it ever afterwards. I must remind you, as a member of the Surnir family line, I have in my possession the secret passed down from my father, and all the might that entails. If the peace and safety of the valley and the Genra Knights is threatened, even by one of our own, I will do all I can to ensure the threat is gone, as my father has before me. Seth had only ever hinted at the secret in these slight ways, and the realization dawned on him that he hated using this tactic. But what else could he do? If anyone else ruled the valley, or fighting broke out, they would ruin everything his father had built. The only way to ensure the safety of the valley through the wisdom of his father was to continue ruling. Seth couldn't let anything or anyone take that away. But the Surnir family secret. What made this tactic so dreadful was the fact that Seth still didn't know what the secret was or where he could find it. Aside from his final words, Lord Surnir I had never told him any details of where it was hidden, and anyone else either didn't know, or was better off not knowing this pivotal weakness of Seth's. Was the secret a military strategy, an ancient magic or sword from one of the Arorite legends, or something even more wondrous? Seth had scoured and searched the tomes in the archives for clues, but there was nothing to be found. It had surely existed. How else could his father have defeated all three warlike lords without a single allied casualty in one day? Nevertheless, he had to use this empty threat to stave off potential enemies. But if it were ever found out by the outskirt stewards that the secret had been lost... No, best not to think about that. Seth continued. Your designs for this valley are ludicrous, and would invite only death and destruction to our people. If I find that you have begun to take disobedient action, your end will be swift. Follow the rule of my father, and I will lead you to a peaceful and fruitful existence. Just have patience. Your lord, Seth Surnir II. Seth sank into a chair at the table. Though only a minute long, the dictation had exhausted him. This was the safest move overall, he was certain. The only way it could fail is if they recognized it as the desperate bluff that it was. though to do so would be ridiculously careless on their end. It would work. It had to. Have 2 more copies of that message made, and send each one to an outskirt citadel. Madame Athel nodded, but she didn't move. She looked at Seth with... how strange, she was worried. He had never seen her look at him like that. She had always either been some shade of annoyed or simply disappointed he never did enough. My lord, she spoke very quietly, but with a cold intensity. As one of the few who knows of the secret's existence, are you certain this is the best option to ensure peace? You will bear the totality of any retaliation that may occur. What else can I do? Anything else might throw everything we've done into turmoil. This is extreme, I know that, but it will make peace for my people all but certain for now. Even if it is a bluff, it is one they can't afford to call. Madame Athel was silent for a moment. When she spoke again, it was with a voice that was softer than Seth had thought possible. I must apologize for what I said earlier today, my lord. You are far more akin to your father than I had imagined. The messages shall be delivered at once. Seth was stunned as she handed the parchment to Margie, who promptly began to carry out the order. How could she consider him akin to his father? It was exactly what he had always wanted to hear from Madame Athel, but not in this situation. He had desperately bluffed power he didn't have, hadn't given the matter more than a minute's thought, and threatened those under him with death. Perhaps there was little choice he had in the matter, but surely his father would have reacted differently. Seth wanted to wonder aloud if she was mocking him in a new and cruel way, but he couldn't sense any sarcasm in her voice, and besides, such a thing was beneath her. Though he hadn't eaten since noon, the thought of food was suddenly repulsive to him. Worry like bubbling bile filled his stomach. Seth stood up, wavering so slightly that no one but him could tell. Please excuse me, Madame Athel. I shall retire to my room for the night. Have Elle or yourself speak the meal in my stead. Strangely, she didn't stop him. At your command, Lord Cernier. Rest beneath wisdom and awaken early on the morrow, that you may rule wisely. A common bedwish within the Cernier clan, but one that now only worsened Seth's fear. As he climbed the steps of the grand stairwell, Seth shook his head. How foolish his joy a few minutes ago had been. To think he had started to consider himself on the path of a good ruler simply because he talked to a few people, offered banal advice, and had a single ordinance succeed. When true leadership was needed, he just floundered, groping blindly along dangerous paths. And yet, Madame Athel's words pulled at his chest. There must have been truth to them, in some way, but how? His father's secret. It still existed, as it was simply lost. It would be difficult, but he could find it and then control it. Ruling by his father's will, as he already had done with the schedule, Seth could keep the peace and save the happiness of the valley. It is decided, then, he whispered to himself as he entered the archives at the top of the citadel as the tone of the golden dinner gong began to sound. He stopped before the painted image of his father leading the Aerites up the Kerfell Mountains, stern and fearless even in death. If there was a clue to be found regarding the whereabouts of the secret, perhaps it would not be in the tomes as he had thought, but here, in the actions of his father. I must find it. Seth placed a hand upon the frame of the painting and closed his eyes. If I cannot, how could I possibly become worthy of your legacy?